Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of the Martech Show. Hope your week is going well. I am very excited for our guest today, Oren Greenberg, who is the founder of Krave, which is a growth marketing consulting agency. It's great to be here with you, Oren.
Great pleasure. Thanks for having me, Scott.
So last year, you started a project that was absolutely fascinating. Is you took like the raw data of the companies who were in the Martech landscape, and then you matched that up with this enormous data set from SimilarWeb, showing like traffic patterns to the domain names of all those different Martech companies, over multiple years, and really started to like identify, some sort of fascinating trends, happening to web traffic there that starts to have some seriously interesting implications about like, well, what's actually happening with these companies and the spaces they're in. So I'm thrilled to have you come and join us and do a little bit of a walkthrough of that research you did and get a chance to chat about it.
Sure, that sounds great. Happy to do that.
So do you want to share your
share my screen
presentation?
Yeah, can you see that now?
We can see that now. Martech Wars. I love it.
Martech. So I wanted a bit of like a Netflix episode. I needed a bit of flow of the dramatic, an extension of Game of Thrones. Now that's over. So obviously what we did is we took, the fantastic work that you've done. And I know that you manually go through all the different websites in the Martech landscape each year and handpick them. And that's very difficult, very challenging. And then obviously with a collaboration with SimilarWeb, they enriched the data, and then I worked on it for about 2.5 months with a data scientist, and because there's a lot of data and trying to get meaningful insight out of raw data is not as easy as it sounds. So it took a little while, and what we're going to go through now is what I thought was the most interesting distilled insights. Obviously, taking raw data, you can manipulate the narrative in lots of different forms. So I needed to try and find something that I thought was interesting. And I think it's pretty clear as we go through the deck, what are the main stories that I was trying to narrate from what I was seeing in the data. So I mean, some of it's a bit of artistic liberty, but a lot of the data is representative. I think definitely the goal with this is to update it every 6 months to 12 months, and then once a year or a couple of times a year we'll be able to see how it's changing. And I think that's going to be something that's quite interesting. So I'm very much inspired by your work of how you've been mapping the Martech landscape each year since 2011. Then very similarly, I think it was hopefully just add an additional dimension to the amazing work you've done.
Yeah, seriously cool. So we're eager. What did you find?
What did I find? So I think that the thing that was most shocking to me was, I'm always like quoting Pareto, 80-20, and I was quite surprised that 3 websites out of 7,182. So obviously in the Martech landscape, there's 8,000, but once you kind of cut it down to just the unique domains, and because some of them reappear in different categories, it comes to about 7,182 websites, and only 3 websites, which is Google, YouTube, and Facebook, they command 78% of all the web traffic. And this is from kind of May 2017 to the end of 2020 to December. So it's 3.5 years worth of data, and it's still quite shocking to see that they command such a disproportionate amount of the traffic. Now, I think it's worth pointing out B2C versus B2B, where obviously a lot of Martech is 5,000 of the 7,000 is SaaS, and obviously B2B won't get as much traffic. But nonetheless, if you think about it as like maybe as a measure of attention or a measure of consumer awareness of the properties in the Martech landscape, then it's a very interesting to see that proportion. And I think this does reflect the behavior. So that's the first kind of key insight. And obviously, Scott, at any point, if there's something you want to ask or contribute, feel free to just stop me because I can go on my monologue for quite a while here. And then what was interesting is it's like a pyramid of monopolies. And there isn't just like the top monopolies, the FANGs. There's actually monopolies and monopolies and monopolies because it's such a fragmented landscape. And then what was very evident is that the next set of monopolies was actually 68 websites. And when you combined it, these 71 websites command 98% of all the traffic. And effectively, if you think about it, it's a top 1% of all the Martech landscape commands 98% of all the traffic. So obviously, even showing 71, when you think 7,182, obviously the infographic tries to capture that. It's too much for the brain to process, and even 71 is too many. So I just thought I'd put on the top 25 to kind of go through. And that personally, when I saw these, some of them were not surprising. You know, Google, YouTube, Facebook, Yahoo, Twitter, Reddit, eBay, not surprising. What was interesting was how the similar web data picked up on Outbrain, Taboola, and Criteo, because these aren't destinations, they're intermediaries that traffic goes through because of programmatic display or their native content. So I thought that was very interesting. And then, you know, I mean, Stack Overflow, which is also surprising because it's very much developer centric. It's interesting to see that it's actually in the top 71 websites in the Martech landscape. Like that was, I wouldn't have expected that. I know it gets a lot of traffic. I just would have assumed it was niche. So some things here were a bit of a surprise to me. Others were very obvious and blatant. Quora, Microsoft, other ones were familiar.
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of it is, I mean, these companies are interesting when I put them on the landscape because they have some slice of what they do that seemed relevant to the context of, okay, as a marketing ops, marketing tech person, you know, like I'm using Google for, you know, Google Analytics is almost guaranteed. But yeah, you know, to your point, you know, the data from SimilarWeb isn't really distinguishing, saying, oh, well, what percentage of these people were actually looking to like go and manage their Google Analytics or their AdWords accounts or things like that. It's like all of Google. But I think it's a fair perspective to say, okay, even though obviously the vast majority of traffic to Google is not quote unquote MarTech traffic, the fact that Google has just such a dominant share of where people are spending their time, that nonetheless influences the degree to which, like, you know, it's probably not coincidence that Google Analytics, you know, and Google AdWords have such the enormous popularity they do.
And also with this, I did something very different where, you know, everyone always talks about FANGs, you know, the Ubers and the Pinterest, the largest websites in the world. And then this presentation is actually more focused on the rest of the landscape. And the rest of the landscape, when we think about it, the 7,111 websites, if we think about how many people are employed those businesses and how they actually represent the majority of the MarTech landscape in terms of business entities and serving lots of very specific problems and more niche, you know, clients and a B2B and also B2C, then they only represent 2% of the web traffic. And a lot of the rest of the deck's actually more focused on that. And when I was showing this to, you know, I went through this with quite a few interesting people like Rand Fishkin and Ashley from a consultancy and some other people. And some people were saying, well, I'm not interested in the 2%. I want us to really focus more on the top 71 or the top 1%. And I felt like actually we can do that in another presentation or another time. I just thought they get so much attention all the time anyway. Why don't we give attention to the Davids? Because everyone always talks about Goliath and David, and you know, everyone favors David, but everyone always talks about Goliath. So I was like, you know what, let's just talk about David for a change in today's narrative. And I think that it's more fragmented, and because it's more long tail, it has more pearls and more insight, I thought. So some of the data goes around that. Should I go to the next one?
Oh yeah, let's see it.
So, okay, so there's a top 1%. So this is 99% of the websites. And now here what was interesting was looking at the traffic growth. So 2018 to 2019 saw 23% growth, 1.7 trillion to 2.06 trillion visitors. Unsurprising, this is almost as much money as you know, as being put into Bitcoin by Tesla. Not quite ridiculous numbers. And here what we can see is that's about 358 billion uniques in terms of the total traffic, in terms of growth. And all of that growth actually came from the top three. So you're going to go, wait, so all 23% of growth just happened for the top three. And actually it's not 100%, it's actually 101.95% because the rest of the websites actually shrunk. So actually those top three commanded 101.95%, and then everything else actually saw a shrinkage. And you kind of go, wait a second, how can it shrink? You kind of go, well, there's a lot of other websites, you know, there's probably, I don't know, 2 trillion, 3 trillion websites out there. In reality, probably only the top 10 million websites get most of the traffic, right? So that top trillion number, even though, you know, everyone and their mum has a website, doesn't mean anything. But in terms of the ones that actually get the traffic, there's still probably, I don't know, 5 million, 10 million out there. So 7,000 of 10 million is still a very small section. It's just the MarTech landscape as it's defined. So it's possible that that traffic is percolating into these other websites that are just not in the data set, or they've shifted into the top three.
Yeah, it really does drive home. And, I'm so used to thinking about, MarTech competition just within and among MarTech companies. But yeah, part of your research here just like really drives home to me the reality that, okay, it's not your competition just with other MarTech vendors. It's just this competition for attention with everything else that's happening in the digital universe. And that is some really intense competition.
Yeah, yeah, news outlets and mobile apps like TikTok, and news consumption, and then newsletters and email. I mean, if you think about it, all the email newsletters that are being read or consumed, it's not represented in this data in any material way, because this is only web URL data, right? It's only website, so it's going through a Chrome browser. In terms of what's hitting those websites. So yeah, there's a lot of other avenues that we don't have visibility on, like dark social, that isn't necessarily captured here effectively. So what was also interesting was trying to think about 18 to 19, okay, what happened 19 to 20 then? And then we can see, okay, there was growth between 19 and 20, and that's positive, because the more traffic goes to the MarTech landscape, then that's more opportunity for commercialization and revenue generation and delivering value to people, and that's fantastic. And here we can see actually quite different, so the growth was only 225 billion compared to the 385 or so in the previous one. And the top three now, instead of 101.95%, they were about 65.6% of growth, which are obviously you kind of go, okay, great. So the rest of the traffic clearly went to the rest of the top 1%, and there were 34.4 growth. But as we talked about before, monopolies within monopolies within monopolies, and actually the 99% of the websites actually only saw a 1% growth. And so once again, the top 1% are massively dominant. So you get the top three, gigantic ones are completely disproportionate. And then you have all the rest, which is the top 1%, and they got 34% of the growth. And then only 99% of the websites, the 7,111, only saw 1% growth in terms of traffic in an entire year.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Like, part of it, I wonder, so obviously there's all these pressures on traffic going to the long tail of MarTech websites. And some of that's just, the sheer competition for attention, as we talked about, certainly competition, among MarTech companies. But also, like, it felt like over 19 and 2020, there started to become more and more of a distributed content marketing strategy at a lot of MarTech companies, where they were like, still very much creating, educational and informative content, but it was perhaps increasingly, less hosted on their own domains, and being distributed, whether it was through things, like YouTube for videos, or, articles on Medium or things like that. I know it's this is all, theses that one can, hypothesize, but hard to know.
Yeah, I got it. So essentially you're saying that it could be that the traffic that's actually shifting away from going to their direct Martech website or blog or white papers or ebooks is actually going on the Medium publication that Martech company is hosted, and Medium is clocking the traffic, but that Martech entity could be benefiting from reading the article on Medium that's associated with their identity. And it could be that actually so much of a company's real estate isn't actually the website. The real estate is actually all these other assets that are owned but actually hosted on third parties. I think it's very interesting, the point you're making, because when you think about like the rise of Substack and other type of platforms that are trying to move away, they're effectively attacking the medium, which is garnering all of the authority for SEO and all the traffic that's going through it, and actually building up its own authority, and actually taking that and giving that back to the influencer, giving that back to the publisher, so to speak, the author, and empowering him to own the audience. And that's an interesting shift that we're seeing as well, right? So there's, I think, this war within the Martech war, is a sub-war on who owns the content and who owns the traffic distribution of that content. And that's a very interesting topic, because it relates to what's happening in Australia and Facebook, right? So it's happening with who owns the news, who's monetizing the news. Is it Google? Is it Facebook? Who owns the audience relationship, and who owns the traffic? Because then whoever owns the traffic can obviously monetize that, and that's where the magic happens. But then it creates a real problem for the content producer. So I think it's very interesting overarching forces that are happening in the market on B2C and B2B.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes so much sense. It's almost like, when I look at the 1% or like the top 3 websites or the top 25 websites, you know, that just have this enormous amount of traffic. Yeah, it's kind of hard from a, you know, like a marketing perspective to not say like, okay, well, this is really where I want distribution. You know, whatever my product is, whatever is hosted on my main site, hey, listen, that's great, that's wonderful, you know, but frankly, as much as I can get in front of people's like eyeballs through the places they're already going, but yeah, that is definitely, as you point out, there's like a tension, you know, between these trade-offs of, you know, well, who actually owns the audience, yeah. All right. So carry on. I could like spend an entire half hour just on this one slide. There's so much
slides
here.
is a half an hour conversation on its own. Yeah. Okay. So what was quite interesting is so the y-axis is the market share of each player in each one of the 49 subcategories. So the Martech landscape split into subcategories, and then we looked at the biggest one in each subcategory, and that's effectively the plotting of them on the y-axis by total share of the traffic in that category. Right, and I'll get a bit more specific if it's a bit amorphous at the moment. And then the x-axis is the total amount of traffic in that category. So we're trying to understand is, you know, how much traffic is in the category and how much of the total traffic in that category does a market leader own in that specific category. And they're plotted on the graph to try and understand relationships. So here's an example. If we look at agile linen management, it's one of the 49 categories, and it has about 50 different players. And what we're interested in is who was the biggest player in the category? And it was Atlassian. Okay, so how much did Atlassian actually grow in the period 2017 to 2020? And they grew by about 115% in terms of total traffic. So then this is very interesting. It's like, okay, well, this is the largest growth rate across all of the kind of top category leaders in the Martech landscape. And what was also interesting was, you know, because humans, we love extremes, we love contrasts to try and make a point, who lost the most, who dropped the most. And here was a DMPs, and I think this is indicative of the category as a whole. And you can see that the whole category has obviously, you know, the total market share has shrunk, and Predictor in terms of total traffic also shrunk. So the market share shrunk, and you can see how the market share shrunk relative to total traffic. They dropped from 1.1 million to about 20K, which is a 98% drop. Obviously a much more humble amount of traffic than Atlassian in terms of relative terms as well. So it's not surprising that there's a lot more volatility across you know, smaller players or smaller categories, because the total traffic that they have is a lot smaller, so the fluctuations are a lot more extreme. Yeah, but it's quite interesting. Obviously, this is just like a very small snapshot of just 2 businesses in 2 categories of 49 categories of 7,111 websites. But what is interesting is the most extreme contrasts, the ones who've gained the most and ones who've lost the most, because of their total market share in their individual category.
Yeah, this was a really fascinating way to look at it because, I mean, it's definitely interesting to see for individual companies and, you know, who seems to be winning, you know, just audience, you know, within their respective category. But yeah, just, you know, the data you got that basically in very quantitative terms, you know, shows the rising popularity or declining popularity of a category over time. I mean, you know, for those of us, you know, who like live and breathe Martech, seeing that data management platforms, you know, have kind of tanked over the past couple of years, you know, perhaps not surprising intuitively, like, you know, we've sort of known that just in patterns, you know, of, you know, what people are using and adopting. But it's one thing to have that as sort of like, oh yeah, my impression is this is sort of shifting away from, you know, this category to something else. But to be able to actually quantify it, you know, through web traffic here, yeah, this, yeah, just super interesting.
Quantify, but also hopefully predict. So one of the things I'm trying to play with now is, you know, if I can update and get the data real time or on a monthly basis, I can start to see some sort of pattern. And based on that pattern, what's my statistical probability and confidence level that is predictive of the future? That's something I've been playing around with to try and see if that's viable as well. Because then it's very interesting to kind of go, okay, well, it looks like I'm not going to go and buy that piece of software as a DMP because I think the category is in decline and it's going to continue to decline because of the trend. And I have relatively high confidence. So I'm not going to go do that. I'm going to look at an alternative, which we'll talk about in a second anyway, you know, specifically with the DMP category. So here, you know, we plotted all of the traffic by all of the categories. So these are all the categories, and the x-axis is 2017 and the y-axis is 2020. You can see how different categories have grown over time. And you can see at the very bottom, if you have a microscope in front of your computer, you can zoom in and see the different categories, or you can just download the the infographic from your blog, and they can see
everyone who uses the infographic actually has a microscope on their desk. Anyways.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the only people who are interested in Martech are like,
Right.
microscopic scientists, right? Data scientists. That's what they say when they say data scientists. I mean, a person with a microscope. Yeah. So then here you can see what was interesting is like, okay, so which categories grew the most, right? So we looked at the market leaders in the previous slide, and so I just wanted to show 3 of the fastest growing. You can see the little red dot represents the governance, compliance, and privacy. Not surprising, GDPR, COPA kicking in, and obviously more software required to try and solve that. You can see in the little red dot on the left, there's 54, which means there's 54 different players in that category as defined in Martech landscape. And then we go to account-based marketing, which is there's about 30 players, so quite a small category, and that grew by 232%, which is pretty significant. And the hypothesis there is, you need to have a more orchestrated, coordinated attack on your target accounts, and therefore sales and marketing need to play better together. So ABM provides a more qualitative, a more narrow, more focused approach. And I think the growth in the category is representative of the fact it probably delivers, right? It probably delivers value, and that's growing as a category because it's delivering some sort of ROI to businesses that are investing in it. And the third one is CDP, customer data platforms. So one of my pet favorite categories, because I think CDPs are very interesting. There are about 54 players in there, and that's also seen some massive growth. And obviously we saw one of the top players in the CDP space get bought out by, I think, $3.4 billion the other day by Twilio, who bought Segment, and that was, we'll look into their traffic pattern in a second, and I thought that was very interesting. So here we can see effectively 3 categories, the rise in growth over the last kind of 3.5 years. What's very interesting, if you notice, the top 3 are the very bottom left of the category. And it's not surprising that nascent categories are going to get a lot more growth that's proportional to their size. It's going to be a lot larger than very mature categories like CRM that has 260 players. That category has been around for so long, it's not going to see a 200% growth in traffic. I mean, even though CRM is growing year on year, which is still interesting, it's not growing at the same rate because it's a much more mature category. And I think that's the last point to make on that slide that was interesting.
Yeah, one thing I find interesting here is, so one of the recurring themes we hear in digital marketing is blank is dead, right? Like, every year somebody does like email is dead, even though it's like the most popular communications channel, in business. But yeah, one of the things I sort of take away, from this research you did here was, I know a number of folks have said like SEO is dead, which I think actually your data here proves absolutely not. I mean, in these categories, it seems like there's a reasonable thesis that basically as new technologies and new approaches to how marketers can do business come up, like, oh, well, we want to do account-based marketing, or, oh, okay, listen, there's now these new regulations, how do we make sure we're compliant with them? What sort of governance do we do? CDPs, what's a CDP? How do I use it? All these things as they sort of like, wave through, the marketing industry, you just get all these people who are searching for like, okay, I want to know what's out here and what the possibilities are, and so that's driving this traffic growth. But I have to imagine, that a significant percentage of this is organic traffic that's coming as a result of people doing, Google searches on this. So if I'm in the CDP category, I mean, if I'm not like treating SEO as like, one of my top priorities, it feels like I'm really missing out on the market.
Yeah, I think SEO is probably one of the highest ROI challenge, because people are in a need state when they're looking for a keyword. They engage in their interests. It's not like the majority of paid advertising, which I'm tapping into a cold audience, and then I have to nurture them and educate them, and I have to play a numbers game. SEO is the biggest challenge. Saying that, when you look at a lot of data and surveys from CMOs and where they allocate their budget, SEO is one of the channels that receives the smallest amount of marketing budget. And you kind of go, that's completely dichotomous. How does that make sense? And the answer is, it's really, it's a black box. You can't measure it and you can't control it. Like when I go into Google Ads, I can press play, I can press and pause. I have measurability, I understand what the metrics are. I can go to the board and I can make a point for additional budget because I can measure it effectively. SEO, I can keep pouring money into it, not get a result. And if the board asks me, when am I going to get a result by, or is it going to help build and get me a certain amount of sales qualified leads in a certain duration or a certain amount of customers in B2C, then I have no ability to predict it. And therefore SEO is actually, I think, overall, a very interesting channel that's probably massively underutilized by a lot of B2B businesses. But the problem is they don't I think that's a double-edged sword, because a lot of B2B businesses over-invest in SEO, and there's not enough search volume because it's too niche and people aren't aware of it. So I think the answer isn't so cut and dry to say invest in SEO. It's really contextual. It needs to be evaluated. Is there category and relevant traffic that's worth it for your niche? If yes, then it's probably an underutilized channel that you, in terms of your competitors, it's really worth you investing in it. Obviously, HubSpot's a fantastic example of the growth that's available from SEO, right? And in terms of a B2B marketing automation provider. So marketing automation, very niche in B2B, and they killed it with SEO, and it fueled the growth of the business. And obviously very much aligned to the philosophy of inbound as well. So it's like all very kind of aligns to the belief in the philosophy. And I think it's what's fueled the growth for HubSpot, right? Part of the reason. Obviously, the technology is very usable, very robust, the pioneer. It's a lot of other variables. But yeah, SEO, very interesting channel.
Definitely. All right. So next slide. What's I'm like on my seat's edge.
yeah, we're definitely with this rate, we're not going to get through all of them, but hopefully we'll get through some of them, and that will deliver some insight to the audience. So here, it's important to understand this graph is, we had to exclude the top 1% because they command so much of the traffic that everything is skewed. So you just remove them because it makes my life easier. And we then can get some meaningful insight. So everything, the rest of the slides, the majority are excluding the top 1%. And here where you can see CDP category, 54 companies, and you can see segment. Then the absolute numbers in the graphs aren't so important, but look at the shape. And what you can see is segment's growth, surprisingly and very interestingly, it looks almost exact the same as a whole category growth. And obviously, they command a huge amount of the market share in that category, but they're not the only player. Remember, there were a lot of other CDP players. So what you can actually see is as a category is increasing, then there is this correlation between the top player. Not necessarily, right? And statistically, it's like 0.54%. So the correlation isn't so strong. But as a whole, some of the categories definitely are seeing that increase in the total amount of traffic and the top player, even though statistically as a whole, you can't always make that conclusion, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, just segment as a percentage of the total traffic to the category is ridiculously impressive.
Yes. I mean, they're the largest. I mean, there's a reason they were bought out, and I think they pioneered it. They obviously cracked it in terms of their competitor set. I don't know the story why. I do know it was a very reputable and highly regarded in the growth marketing community, and it's always a go-to when someone talks about a CDP. And I think they were they capitalized really on the decline of DMPs, right? So CDP grew as DMPs is in decline, and I think part of that is the reason that programmatic is in decline in display. That's moving to search. It's moving to social. I think cookies, the shift to mobile. There's a few different factors there as to why DMPs are kind of in decline, why CDPs have grown, and segment was just the first and the best to capitalize on that growth. So we looked at the top 3 that grew the most. I guess it's also interesting to think about which ones shrunk the most. So marketing analytics, performance and attribution, which to me was very surprising. Social media marketing and monitoring, which is also quite surprising because I don't think social is going anywhere. I think social is just experiencing fragmentation, but I don't see it in decline. Actually, since one of those categories that probably will continue to increase. But it's interesting to see that the tools around it have seen sort of the traffic decline. And if I'm honest, I don't have, from my research, I couldn't find a valid or reasonable, I talked to lots of different marketing experts. I couldn't find a good reasoning for this. And a lot of people said it's surprising to them as well. But DMPs, I do feel is a very sensible argument logically for saying it's in decline because of the shift in display and spend and privacy. And it's not surprising that DMPs are kind of seeing a decline as a category.
Throw out a couple hypotheses because why not? Because definitely those first 2 were surprising to me as well. One thought is on the marketing analytics, performance and attribution. I wonder if part of that is frankly my fault, that I had sort of split out some different categories and I had this group of specialists, in marketing analytics. But then I had a whole nother category that was much broader for, essentially business intelligence, customer intelligence. And I think, in practice, we see, just where the rise of analytics and data science in organizations, is exploding. The profession's growing, at double-digit rates. But I wonder if part of what's happening there is just more of that analytical focus is being absorbed by things that are in that broader business intelligence, customer intelligence category. Which, again, from your research, it maybe raises the question of, if you are a specialist marketing analytics vendor at this point in time, are you fighting, you're not fighting the other specialist marketing analytics vendors, perhaps you're fighting more of the business intelligence, customer intelligence platforms. And social media, the one I wondered about that was, because I'm with you, right? I mean, my goodness, outside of search, this continues to be, the incredible growth channel of just, where the audience is. And marketers, we go where the audience is. It's a very simple rule. But I wonder if part of what's happening there is, in some ways, even like with search marketing and things like this, that there are so many experts out there, some of them self-declared experts, but some actual genuine experts, in social media that, they have their own blogs, they have their own domains, they're more on the consulting side or an agency side. And perhaps they're the ones that are actually creating more and more of the most useful educational content. And so perhaps just more of the, marketers interested in social media are going to those sources for information more than the websites of the MarTech vendors themselves. But again, these are both just hypotheses that, you could throw stones at pretty easily.
And if it's any reassurance to the people listening, is, I did spend 2 days trying to reclassify the way you did the categories to try and understand what's going on. And it's so challenging because of the way businesses fit into multiple categories to try and identify the classification. It is a very complex challenge. And I gave up on it. So I think it's like very admirable that you've done such a I think people don't understand how great a job you did until you try to do it yourself and you realize this is a hornet's nest, very complex and difficult. And I remember at one point, some of the websites, they fit into like 30 categories, like an individual entity fits into so many categories. You're like, well, what do I classify them? Because I can't have them in everything. So it's a very difficult problem. And I think there is a question here around how to dissect the data on an aggregate level to get the insight from it. And is that done on the category level? Is it on an individual website? Is it individual sets? And I think, hopefully as I spread this piece of work and different people give me thoughts and ways to analyze it, I can come back with different answers and more creative solutions that can give us more, can give us the evidence that we need to make better business decisions, because that's the goal of this, right? The goal is to help businesses grow, help people create amazing tools that help other people. And the more we can give them accurate data that represents reality, the more likely they will be to succeed. And that's the kind of ambition with the project, right? So let me continue to the next slide, because you have quite a few to go through. So this is the social media marketing monitoring category. And you can see the drop pretty significantly. And then I looked at the top player that had the largest market share that also dropped significantly, and that's GFM. And I was, to be honest, when I saw this, I was embarrassed because they received so much traffic, like 578 million, and I never heard of them. I thought like, wow, I've been doing this for 20 years now, and this is such a huge website, I never heard of it. And then I realized there's so many websites out there I've never heard of. So I was like, okay, fine. But what was very interesting is, once again, like segment was on the up, and the category for CDP was on the up. The social media marketing monitoring category is on the down, and the top player is on the down. And I thought that was very interesting as well.
All right, I'm not going to hold you back anymore. I know we're running out of time, but yeah.
Yeah, otherwise you can do it. I mean, obviously, the original deck had slides, and I had to cut it down for the time limit. So, I doubt we'll get through everything. So here, we're looking at the traffic growth distribution. So effectively what I did is I took the sites and I grouped them into small, medium, and large. And I did it by total traffic that they receive into these 3 buckets here on the top right. And then I tried to understand what is the growth rate variability according to the category that they belong to. So here we can see that about 16% of all the ones that in the small category were declining. And you kind of go, okay, well, that on its own isn't very meaningful. But now when you think about medium, you kind of go, whoa, there's a hell of a lot more websites in medium that actually, they had a shrinkage in terms of the total amount of traffic over the time frame. And you're like, okay, that's really interesting. So mediums are declining a lot more rapidly than the small. So surely big must be a lot more in decline, a lot more rapidly than medium. And then you're like, no, not really. And you kind of go, okay, that's interesting. So what's going on? So there's the big, obviously, they're pretty solid. They're not seem to be moving anywhere. The small don't have anywhere to go to because they're quite small. If they go any lower, they cease to exist. And then the medium are kind of like fluctuating quite a lot between the big and the small. So it's quite interesting to see this kind of the war, the friction between the websites and the category that they belong to. And here you can see with the stagnant, that interestingly enough, a lot of the websites that are small, they're just not managing to grow. And for me, if you asked me to guess before I had the data, I would have said oh, I reckon the biggest are in decline, and I reckon the biggest are in stagnant. And then you can see here, this isn't the case. It's actually it's very hard when you're a small business to compete. That's effectively what the data, as I'm understanding it, shows. So then what about growth? And actually you can see growth also a bit of a pessimistic view. I mean, optimistic for the big companies, pessimistic for the small. If you're small, it's a lot harder for you to get more traffic growth than if you're very big. Which is not surprising. You know, you have bigger budgets for marketing, you're an established brand, you just trust, there's credibility, familiarity, you're probably the first in the category, your technology is probably superior to new contenders. There's a reason that the big manage to probably add eclipse. But very interestingly enough, when we look at rapid, the small are growing rapidly because obviously as a proportion of their base, to go from 10,000 uniques to 100,000 uniques, a 10x growth is a lot easier than going from 10 million to 100 million, which is where the big are playing, right? They're playing on a much larger volume. It's just because to buy traffic, you pay more as you want to buy more traffic, because all the main channels, the Google, Facebook, Quora, Reddit, doesn't matter where you go, you're in a bidding war and you have to bid more to get more traffic. Therefore, it becomes more expensive and harder to get more traffic. So it's not surprising to see small ad eclipsing on the rapid growth trajectory compared to medium and large.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some correlation here to like just sort of like patterns in like VC portfolios where again like I'm making these numbers up from some sort of vague memory of this, but like if sort of like half the investments in the portfolio end up just not really going anywhere, and then you have like maybe that 20% or so, 25% that they grow, but it's modest, and then you have that maybe 20% of the portfolio that more than makes up for the other 80% of the portfolio really taking off. And it's interesting to at least see that perhaps there is some correlation to that in the growth rates you saw on the small side.
Yes, I think the truth is, if you think about the VC model, it's highly diversified, which is a risk, because they don't know who's going to skyrocket. Because if they did, they wouldn't be investing in the small businesses and the medium, they're just going the big. The truth is no one knows, we can't predict the future. So then what happens is they diversify the investments. And then I think it's a very interesting question from a risk mitigation investment point of view, like, how to think about the growth rate and the relationships where growth is going to come from. I think the magic formula to get predictive, I showed this data to some VCs, and out of all the data, the only question they had was, can it help predict who is going to grow next? Because if you think about their mindset, it's all about how to capitalize on the growth of their investment to get the ROI that they need, right, across their portfolio. So a very interesting mindset, having a business analyst view it, a VC view it, a marketeer view it. A Martech marketeer is different than a performance marketer. It's very interesting to see the different perspectives of people on the data set.
Yeah. So Oren, I know we're going to be coming up here on our time, and boy, like we could do like a marathon. Like this is the 3-hour Martech Show with Oren Greenberg, and I would love it. Do you want to maybe like find one last slide or so that would be the point you'd like to leave people with?
Oh, the point. Do I want to skip to the point?
I mean, all of these points have been fascinating, so I feel terrible like rushing you through the last bit of this.
Okay, like to slice it from 29 slides. Just the slides we shot today was challenging. So it's like I'm kind of getting used to the chopping now. It's okay. So I think this is probably the summary slide in terms of the narrative, and the narrative that I wanted to communicate was what's happening with that 1% of the websites that are commanding 2% of the total traffic as a whole. What's the kind of picture of them? And I thought what was very interesting was the 22% of them are stagnant. So they're not really growing or shrinking, which is not good if you're a small business. You really need to grow to compete, because if you're stagnant for too long, you're probably not going to survive because of increasing competition. As we see, there's more and more Martech players. So stagnant isn't good. A decline is obviously even worse, because if you're declining, there's other traffic in other slides that I showed that your probability of recovery from a consistent decline is 2%. So your probability of surviving, if you have a constant decline over a long period, I call it resurrection as a pattern, your probability of making it out is very low. So it's not likely. So if you're in the stagnant or decline category, things are not good. And unfortunately, 63% of all the 1% of the websites are in this situation where traffic-wise, and from a marketing point of view, traffic is everything. Traffic is leads are a sales pipeline is new revenue is marketing budget and growth. So, for a lot of SaaS businesses, which is 5,000 of the 7,000, traffic is a very strong indicator, especially if they have a free trial, or they have other kind of growth that is dependent on inbound marketing. Obviously, a lot of B2B, they have inside sales, or they even have field sales or channel partners, and they're not necessarily relying on traffic, but a lot of them are, especially if they're small, on the smaller end of the value. So if you're paying 50 quid, 100 quid, even 500 a month, then you're going to be a self-serve customer, free trial customer. You're not going to have the ability to pay for an inside sales to do lead generation. You're going to have to rely on inbound to generate that traffic. And there's a lot of those websites that fit into this category who are probably struggling. Then only 37% saw growth, which is a little over a third. And I think this is kind of the overall conclusion is, it's really tough out there. It's a jungle. I don't think the founders listening to this are surprised by what I just said. I'm not sure marketeers understand how difficult it necessarily is. And I think that to give it a quantification of how hard it is, I think it was interesting when I saw the data and kind of put it together.
Yeah, I think you put your finger right on it. I mean, it's, one of the things I've just seen, like, over the past 10 years of growth of this landscape is, to me, what's fueled it as much as anything, well, almost entirely, is just the barriers to entry to creating software have dropped to effectively as close to zero, asymptotically as close to zero as we're going to get. And so, as people come up with ideas and new ways of tackling things, there's just this very easy way to pull together a product and get something out into the market. What your research here, I think, really, shows is, yeah, I mean, building the software, I don't want to say it's a piece of cake, but yeah, boy, if you can't win in the market, in really getting that mind share and ultimately quantifying that through like actual traffic of people coming to you as the source of authority, in what you're doing, that is where the battle is. And this puts us in really stark relief.
Yeah, and distribution is king.
Oren, this is just fantastic. I'm not kidding. I really could do like a 3-hour marathon with you. We could give a prize to like anyone who's stuck with us for those 3 hours.
Anyway, I managed to make it through, yeah.
Listen, if folks want to follow up with you, what's the best way to, what site do you want to point them at? IDs on Twitter, or what's the best way?
Cool is if we could put a URL, I'll give you a URL, and then we can add it, and then people can download the report and access it themselves. And
that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and then I'm also, by downloading it, I'll update them. No spam, no sales crap. Just they can get the update whenever I update the landscape. Because this isn't a lead gen play. This is just like a little passion project. So if they're interested or engaged with that, then they're welcome to. I'll send an email every 6 or 12 months with the updated data, and they can have access and play with it. Obviously, if people have interesting ideas or concepts, they're happy to get in touch and happy to see what I can do.
Very cool. Well, Oren, thank you so much for doing this whole project, +1 for the passion economy, and thank you for coming on the Martech Show to share this with us. Have a great day. Those of you who were with us, thank you so much. This was one of my favorite shows yet. Oren, thanks, and we'll see you all later.